Well, here we go. Second wave feminism is usually well known for its choice of refusing any engagement with gender-mixed political organizations in favor of a deep commitment into women's-only collective. But here I explore what happened when some women stubbornly decided to introduce a feminist perspective within male-dominated organizations such as the trade unions, interrogating their allegedly neutral but on the contrary deeply gendered nature. This presentation, based on my PhD research, elucidates the intersection of the categories of gender and class in the struggles conducted by Italian and French women unionists during the crucial turn of the long 1970s. In both countries, a strong tradition of working-class commitment for women's rights empowerment had been long carried out by the major workers' organizations. However, the international spring of second-wave women's movement questioned the value of this traditional approach and encouraged new critical reflections as well as the development of alternative practices. I'm going to articulate my talk into three main parts. Well, first, I will outline the story of my research, its background, its reasons and its definition also. Well, secondly, I will present the features of my object of study, trade union feminism, and finally I will underline the main findings of my work as well as its unexpressed potentials and future developments. Initially investigating the women's movement of the 1970s, soon I became aware of the often simplistic narrative devoted to this crucial social movement. As an echo of Marxist critiques, second-wave feminism is often described as an homogeneous whole made of bourgeois and well-educated radical young women. This kind of narrative is particularly present in Italy, where indeed radical collectives and their subsequent cultural evolutions established a sort of hegemonic influence and deeply marked collective discourse and imaginary. However, my fieldwork in the archives and through the collection of oral sources, on which I will further elaborate later, led me to realize the actual plurality of the women's movement and raised my curiosity, especially with regard to groups and experiences usually overlooked by historiography. European second-wave feminism is in general an object of study seldom addressed. In fact, it has been difficult for many women historians who entered the academia in the wake of its spread to address this topic, on the one hand because of their commitment in the movement, on the other hand because of their fear of critiques in dealing with such a politicized and contested topic. New generations of historians are beginning to address this object and we are slowly integrating within the global academic debate, but had already started years ago, especially here in the US of course, to problematize a one-dimension narrative of the women's movement, stimulating a new awareness on subjects considered other, such as black feminism and lesbian feminism. I've developed a particular curiosity for what has been called trade union feminism. This stream made an effort to concretely integrate two axes of analysis by considering together the categories of class and gender. Women unionists, deeply influenced by and sometimes directly involved in the second-wave feminist movement, decided to permeate traditional union politics with feminist themes and practices. As feminist labor historians exhaustively demonstrated women's involvement in the workforce and women's commitment within the trade unions were not at all a novelty. On the contrary, there was a long tradition of elaborations and efforts for the claim of equal rights for women on the workplace and for the promotion, for example, of protective legislation. However, my interest for the 1970s arises from the awareness that coherently with the new reflections put forward by the movement, women unionist perspective shifted at the time towards new issues such as the link between the personal and the political, the importance of the body, of gender roles and power relations in societies that interrogated the workers' organizations in an unprecedented way, problematizing not only the priorities of their bargaining strategies, but also their internal dynamics. Beyond the extraordinary period of the two world wars, women entered the formal labor market since the second half of the 20th century on an increasingly massive scale. but their presence in the workplace did not find correspondence in an evolution of the trade unions, nor their needs with regard to labor issues, nor their wants in terms of activism and representation were sufficiently taken into account. So the history of trade union feminism is indeed a history of collective empowerment, but also a history of great struggle. Trade union feminism is a complex and fascinating topic sat at the intersection of two major international phenomena, such as the workers' movement and the second wave feminist movement. But nonetheless, or probably right because of this borderline position, it has been overlooked by historiography, and that's why, not having a precise status, its definition is itself problematic. The choice of referring to it as such as trade union feminism is not irrelevant, because unlike Marxist feminism or working class feminism, this definition applies not just to a theoretical approach, neither just to the class background of the women involved, it explicitly refers to the context where this political experience took place and which it tried to change. Despite the fact that this label bears an important heuristic value, nonetheless it remains quite controversial, as I'm going to show through a couple of quotations. On the one hand, when I interviewed Flora, a woman unionist, she immediately engaged with the title of my project, saying, "Trade union feminism into brackets, right? Because otherwise you will find the radical feminists who would tell you that this was not real feminism." On the other hand, a man unionist, Sandro, shifted the critiques on the other term, stating, "The feminist logic is completely different from the syndical one. Trade unions were a ground which allowed the feminist approach to develop at the time, but it doesn't mean that they accepted or absorbed it." End of quote. So these statements clearly show the difficulty of framing trade union feminism of the 1970s into precise boundaries, and together I think they delineate the interest of this approach that blurred some familiar categories. Despite its being not completely unproblematic, the adoption of the definition trade union feminism, originally designed within the Italian context, proved to be interestingly useful with regard to the French case. Within the existing literature, mainly sociological in fact, the two terms are often combined but rarely in the function of adjective for each other, like trade union feminism or feminist unionism. Professor Margaret Maroney entitled a section of her seminal work, Les syndicats la preuve du féminisme, "Feminism is a plural," and explains that there is an independent feminism and an integrated feminism. There are actual feminist movements and also feminist ideas that circulate and develop outside academia and outside the movement. During a meeting I had with her in Paris, she explained her belief that it can be theoretically correct to speak of feminism with regard to women unionists at the time in France, but that my interviewees themselves would have been reluctant probably to adopt such a label. Could it be possible then to speak of a substantial feminism that was not recognized as such? In the introduction to the interviews I conducted in France, I tried to stick to the suggestion received, and I presented my research as an investigation about feminism in the union, thus underlining the idea of two distinct elements that intersected at a certain point. This approach probably helped my interviewees to feel more at ease. However, I can say that in the course of our long conversations, their cautious attitude has always been gradually fading. Indeed, I think it is necessary to make a distinction between the interviews carried out at the time when the events were taking place, such as those conducted by Professor Maroney, and those conducted today that draw on that experience as a cold reflection situated in a completely different framework of meanings. Self-defining as feminist at the time, in fact, would have meant to clearly situate oneself within the political arena and to take a stand, often against something else, in this case the trade unions. On the contrary, today this rather means to deal with a schism that, despite its developments and its repercussions, is certainly over, and it means also choosing a kind of what I call a family album, in which happily identify one's mates and retrace, with the serenity of retrospect, a shared path. Indeed, most of my French interviewees proved to be fine at considering the terms feminism and unionism together, because of their awareness that our dialogues dealt with a period of ideal hybridization that, despite many difficulties, left important traces in their own lives. We could say that, in the French context, my definition was welcomed by the people who experienced it with some sort of relief, really, as if something complex and difficult to decipher could, through this relatively simplistic definition of historiographical origin, find a means of expression. From this point of view, it is interesting to see how a term coined for a given context, in this case Italy, can be, once duly outlined, adopted elsewhere, in this case in France, providing a valuable heuristic contribution. I will switch a part on the state of the art. Well, just to briefly outline this, the situation in historiography is pretty much the same in both countries, but in France it's important to highlight the interest and the research devoted to trade union feminism by labor sociology, and these are just a few names that it's worth mentioning. Well, moving from research, as you probably imagine, devoted to the experience of trade union feminism in Italy that I conducted for my master, I decided to broaden my perspective, especially in order to problematize an often recurrent assumption that referred to Italy as a kind of exception with regard to this specific stream of second wave feminism. Therefore, I opted for a comparative approach that could, at the same time, question this assumption and shed light on the potential specificities of the Italian as well as of the French case. I made this choice because of the two countries' well-known similarities with regard both to the feminist movement, particularly focused on the idea of difference rather than the idea of equality which prevailed in the Anglophone area, and to the labor movement, with a strong communist trade union together with a progressive Catholic one. For my research, I looked at major trade union organizations, CGL and CISL in Italy, CGT and CFDT in France, and I adopted what can be defined as a translocal approach, focusing on some cities in particular: Turin, Milan, Genoa in Italy, Paris and Lyon in France. This selection was made looking at the highest levels of feminist activism that could be traced in the context of the trade unions in each country. While in Italy, trade union feminism found a particularly fertile terrain in the Interconfederal Metallurgic Federation, and thus in the area of its major strength, the so-called industrial triangle. In France, trade union feminism mainly developed in the public sector and in the tertiary sector, and that's why I selected two of its major centers. My historiographical analysis, moving to the sources, concerns not only the history of events, but most importantly the understanding of its meaning, the meaning of this experience for the life of those who took part in it. To catch overlaps or fractures among multiple representations, it is essential, I think, to take into account different sources, of course. So the archival materials, mainly from trade union and feminist archives, the press, and the collection of oral sources produced through original interviews, giving voice to the personal memories of women and men who animated this experience. The interviews do not simply help to produce new sources, but particularly to produce different sources. As the oral historian Sandro Portelli stated, the element that oral sources provide with greater intensity than any other source is the subjectivity of the narrator. We are informed not only about facts, but about what they meant to those who experienced them. Coming to the core of my work, we could really speak of the introduction of a heretical gender perspective within the boundaries of the labor organizations. The spread of second wave feminism deeply affected the way women unionists used to look at their role, and it led them to question many assumptions of union practice that had been so far taken for granted. They realized the existing gap between the claims for an inclusive class struggle and the reality of a context where women's right to work itself was still endangered, as demonstrated by the habit of identifying women as the first targeted group for layoffs in case of workforce downsizing, for example. While raising objections against the male-centered union approach was everything but easy. The gendered organization of practices and hierarchies was often simply denied. Luisa, a Genoese worker, reported, for example, "The other thing you could hear in the factories from male unionists was, 'Why do you make such claims here in the factory? Actually, it is out, not here in the factory, that you have to fight, because you are first discriminated outside.'" And she commented, "There was always this idea, before this or before the other. This was something that made no sense to us because it was just a way to hush us. What we understood was that, on the contrary, there was not an inside and an outside. It was all the same." While women's efforts to introduce a different but equally relevant point of view in the structures of the unions and in their bargaining politics was marked by enthusiasm as well as by frustration. Pina, a woman unionist, interviewed in a focus group in Milan, described the critical relation with their male colleagues, referring to a feminist slogan they adopted, "Mate in the struggle, master in life," and she told me that, also miming with her hands the feminist symbol of the vagina. So working women started an intense discussion about the relationship between women and work, taking into account the unequal allocation of rights and duties in society as a whole. Women thought that not only did the base relation among the classes need to change, but also the social and cultural superstructures that always put women in a subordinate position. They highlighted the need of being granted equal opportunities in terms of vocational courses and career development. They unveiled that trade union attention to the crucial theme of health on the workplace was most of the time focused just on men's needs and didn't take into sufficient account the issue of reproductive health and contraception, for example. And as an iconic image, this is a booklet produced by the trade unions on health issues on the workplace and the toxicity in the workplace, and as you can see, the representation of the working classes pretty much male-centered. Well, female unionists deconstructed also the artificial boundary between public and private sphere, showing how much personal life was relevant for women's access to the public sphere and to the job market in particular. They strongly emphasized the connection between the workplace and the surrounding territories, stressing the importance of efficient public social services, like, for example, kindergartens above all. They engaged with issues of factory night work for women, and they greatly debated, really greatly, there's tons of documents about this, about the introduction of part-time jobs. Well, for these women, we could say the reinvention of the political was not just a matter of formally obtaining equal rights, but rather it was a matter of guaranteeing their concrete application and above all further modifying gender roles, thus acknowledging women as fully political actors in the realm of social conflict. At the time, women unionists decided to substantially renew the old official committees devoted to women's issues, claiming in particular for greater independence. In Italy, these structures were called coordinamenti donne. They were strictly separatist and interprofessional. In some sectors, such as the metallurgic one, they gathered women even beyond the borders of union confederations. In France, on the contrary, they were called Commission Femmes. They were not necessarily separatist. The situation, in fact, was different between the communist and the Catholic unions. They were never interconfederal, although they jointly supported many initiatives and were often criticized right because of their will of cooperation across borders. With regard to their functioning, again some differences emerged. While in Italy some local departments, namely in the cities considered, proved to be very active and to have great autonomy in setting up their own political agenda, in France we can glimpse a certainly more centralized structure that tended to convey initiatives and information from the national level in Paris towards the peripheries. And my guess is that to a certain extent these dynamics were due to the context. So on the one hand to the structures of the respective trade unions, and on the other hand more generally to the functioning of the state in the two countries, historically very different situations. Well, all this further leads to reflect on the kind of relationship established by women unionists with the feminist movement that in both countries, as generally elsewhere, proved to be fiercely adverse to any kind of hierarchy and national coordination. Well, speaking at large, we could say that trade union feminism and so-called radical feminists were more likely to be closer in Italy, because they were all quite free to autonomously organize at local level and to establish connections there. This is confirmed by the sources and can be explained also by the antagonistic role played in France, much more than in Italy, by women of the radical collectives. In fact, French women of the Mouvement de Libération des Femmes formed within the workplaces all over the country autonomous collectives called Groupes Femmes d'Entreprise, which were supposed to actively challenge the prerogatives or representations of traditional trade unions. So the existence of these collectives concretely competing with the unions complicated much the political relationships between feminists. Want to check? Okay. Well, as underlined above, so the degree of originality of every city's experience was high, and the stimulating aspect of my work has been in fact to delineate their specific features, trying to convey the different meanings they can bring for the understanding of trade union feminism as a whole. So of course it would be impossible to summarize all this, but let me just present a few relevant things about different cities I've looked at. So Turin was characterized by the close relationship established between the local coordinamento and the urban feminist collectives. In particular, they shared a great interest for women's specific health issues, and in November 1978 they jointly decided to occupy an abandoned division of the city hospital Sant'Anna to ask for its being prepared according to the recently approved law on abortion. While informal negotiations with the hospital institution and the city authorities went on for some days, and finally women obtained the acceptance of most of their requests. In Genoa, the local coordinamento organized separatist workshops that dealt with working women's issues and attracted women well beyond the borders of trade unions. I closely looked at their development along the years, and in particular I could conduct a reflection on the relationship established by women unionists with the academic institutions that hosted their workshops, and on their attitude regarding the very issue of knowledge production and transmission. In Milan, a similar experience of workshops was conducted, but it took an unpredictable turn because of an unexpected significant participation of working class housewives. Here I had the chance of dealing with historical materials through the lens of feminist elaborations on the connections between paid work and care work, domestic work. Where in Lyon, the tragic suicide of a leading woman unionist, Georgette Bachet, led me to specifically interrogate the degree of political as well as personal conflict that trade union feminists had to face within the workers' organization. Of course, this case can't be treated as fully representative. Nonetheless, it allows to take into serious consideration the tensions that women unionists had often to face, as well as the impact that such dramatic event had on the local feminist community. Paris, finally, was the setting of another telling event, the so-called Antoinette conflict, During the 1970s, the female magazine Antoinette, issued by the communist union CGT, had got close to some of the issues raised by the feminist movement, and I'll show some of their covers, for example. And after a change, and at the beginning of the 80s, after a change of the union's political governance, the entire editorial board of this magazine was basically removed completely. And this episode crucially marked women unionist feelings and memories with regard to the end of a season of passionate activism and great expectations of change that, in that case, were betrayed, of course. So, coming finally to the main findings of my work, I will touch the following. Well, first of all, as gender historians have underlined, taking fully into consideration the agency of women would lead to a careful revision of traditional chronologies. As for the case of second-wave feminism and of trade union feminism, even more in particular, mine as well as other researchers' works have clearly proved the need of expanding our time frame with regard to the social movements of the 1970s. Women activism fully developed in the second half of the decade, entering then in the 1980s. So placing feminism at its right place in the framework of this period will certainly help us to avoid any simplistic break, such as the recurrent and controversial dichotomy 1970s collective political commitment, 1980s individualism. Second point, while working at the same time on communist and Catholic trade unions led me to highlight the significant role these latter had in providing women with a supportive environment. The progressive character of CISL and CFDT in the 1970s met feminist elaborations on many issues, subjectivity, gender roles, even issues related to the body, that marked women's interest at the time, and that CGL and CGT, the communist unions, were more reluctant to embrace. This is a transnational pattern that was marked by the well-known period of reforms that the Catholic Church inaugurated with the Second Vatican Council. However, the study of its impact and its consequences for the social movements in general, and for the feminist movement in particular, should be further investigated. Although, coming to the third point, the comparative effort I realized had not been sustained by the amount of transnational links I was expecting and hoping for, nonetheless my work does contribute to the current vital wave of gender studies that is increasingly focusing on the circulation of feminist writings across the borders in order to investigate the formation of networks and mostly the diffusions of ideas and theories at the base of feminist activism. I was able to trace many of these intellectual exchanges for trade union feminism in particular, and as I hope that this new set of inquiries will not replicate the marginalization of this voice in the framework of the feminist movements, but on the contrary, with its attention to connections and borrowings, will succeed in delineating a more nuanced and rich picture of the women's movement. To conclude, and to leave the floor for some discussion, I'd like to say that trade union feminism proved to be a fascinating object of study that allows to deconstruct and to question familiar categories, as well as to shed light on their fruitful although complex intersection. My attempt has been to use it as a resource for understanding the relevance of gender with regard to labor history, and at the same time to better articulate the historiographical narrative of second-wave feminism at large. In order to pursue my research, I've now shifted my attention to a more general issue in the framework of social history. During my research in Turin, I found this picture of a picket that was organized in October of the 1980s outside the gates of Fiat, the automobile company, and in the picture, as you will see, women were carrying a banner that stated, "We won't go back home." And I guess that unemployed men would never use the expression "to go back" with reference to the domestic sphere. After my previous research done on the meaning that women attach to their presence in the job market and in the organized labor movement, the finding of this picture led me to interrogate the issue of women's unemployment in the face of corporate restructuring and deindustrialization that began in the aftermath of the 1973 oil crisis and is still affecting Western countries today. But as I wrote, this is another story, so I've finished. Thanks for your attention.